On today's program, we have Joel Preston Smith, a longtime writer, photographer, and artist who served as a photojournalist in the U.S. Army in the late 80s and early 90s. Joel also served on humanitarian aid missions to Rwanda, Honduras, Palestine, and Iraq, among many other places. That's actually what piqued my interest about Joel. But a few years ago, something changed. He went to Standing Rock for one reason and ended up leaving with a completely different vision. Joel soon got swept up in the humanitarian efforts taking place at Standing Rock. He immersed himself completely in it. He walked away connecting with others, and together they formed a unique nonprofit organization called Frontline Wellness United. Frontline provides no-cost integrative medical care, mental health services, and training to individuals and populations working to sustain and further nonviolent social and environmental justice. Frontline also provides public health services to sustain nonviolent resistant movements and provides direct care and creates and maintains the hygiene and sanitation systems necessary to sustain the health of people and agencies dedicated to nonviolent social justice. It's downright fascinating, and here Joel opens up to us about that and so much more. Listen in. Joel Preston Smith, welcome to the show. It's really a great honor to connect with you today. Thank you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, and thank you for all you're doing. There's so much to talk about, as people saw in the introduction with some photos from Standing Rock and some of the things that you've done with your humanitarian efforts through time. But I thought we would use Standing Rock as sort of a springboard and then jump off from there, because you arrived at Standing Rock to help and to offer humanitarian efforts and do other things. But Frontline grew from that and eventually became, as you mentioned to me in our conversation earlier, a nonprofit just last September, right? Is that correct?
Right.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So can you talk about how you got drawn to Standing Rock, and then we can talk about how the other people that were at Standing Rock became the basis of Frontline and then what Frontline Wellness United is actually. So how did you get to Standing Rock? What drew you there?
What drew me was I arrived as part of a documentary film project, so I really wasn't intending to stay. But when I basically concluded that work as a kind of a standard journalist, if you will, I had started volunteering in the medical system there, which was a kind of a very ad hoc kind of system. And I ended up staying 140 consecutive days.
140 days.
Yes, and I had started in kind of just logistics, distribution of supplies and things like that. Really kind of mundane things, including like chopping firewood, for the medics' tent, gathering firewood, carrying water and things like that. And I finished as the tribe's evacuation manager when the camps were being cleared, and the emergency shelter director, because, this is the dead of winter. You were having 22-inch snowstorms, blizzards, and things like that.
That's quite an evolution. In 140 days, you started out this one. You came to be as a documentarian, and then you ended up as the evacuation manager. So, there's so many juicy questions I want to ask you. I was at Standing Rock last summer, and to see to meet with some of the people who had gone through it, and to hear some of their stories really was captivating and also touched me in so many ways. So There's a few questions I want to ask you about Standing Rock. What did you learn about? What was the most unique thing you learned about the people while you were there? Is the first question I'd like to ask you about Standing Rock, and then the other one would be, what was it like being the evacuation manager for something so vast and grand? So let's start with the people at Standing Rock. What are your thoughts about the people that were at Standing Rock?
I would say that it started, and I was there from around like September 10th or 15th in 2016 as something really fantastical. There was a lot of hope. I would say a fair amount of cohesion. There wasn't necessarily a lot of strategy about how to oppose the pipeline. But it was a it was a pretty civil time. And as winter progressed and as arrests got made and there were conflicts that arose in the camps, it became really, really rife with mayhem, disorder, a lot of racial conflict and things like that. But there were really amazing people there, and I tended to associate mostly with medical folks, really amazing doctors and nurses. Some of them drove a couple of thousand miles to come there and take care of people, and it was amazing.
I bet. I know you must have made some interesting connections with people there too as you were moving throughout that, meeting all sorts of different
Mm.
people. Was there one person that really stood out for you, or one or two people that really stood out?
Yeah, I think the person, and it's hard to say just one, but I ended up working with her. She is now the secretary of the board of directors for Frontline, Duck
Frontline.
Bardis.
Hmm.
And when we established the emergency shelter, which wasn't operational until we set it up in the Cannonball district on the reservation, she became the safety officer. And, she was just tough as nails, and nothing got past her. And she helped establish a really safe environment for people coming out of a very traumatic time. So we're talking about in that evacuation, people who had been forcibly removed from camp. Some people had been arrested, had been abused, had been maced, and had suffered a great deal. And in that system, Duck was just really phenomenal. Another person that I had a lot of respect for was Howard Ehrman, who is MD, Master's in Public Health from Chicago, who wanted to vet providers. And what I mean by vetting is it's kind of like a system where you determine whether or not someone who says they have certain kind of credentials actually has those credentials. Because when that system started, you could just kind of like show up and, I'm a doctor, I'm a nurse, and no questions asked. And you got to see patients. But there were some providers that were really determined to protect patients and to do things like make sure that public health standards were pretty high, because you had as many as 10,000 people dispersed through those three camps, and a lot of kind of opportunities for them to get sick and spread common diseases, colds, flu, things like. There were a lot of great practitioners that helped ensure that none of those kind of disasters happened.
Wow. So, what was it like morphing into the evacuation manager? How did that come into being? And can you describe some of those experiences and what that was like? Because it must not have been light and simple. It seems intense to me.
No. It partly came into being because of the disaster work that I've done. So I'm FEMA trained in disaster response and disaster management, and had worked in Honduras after Hurricane Mitch, and Rwanda at the end of the Civil War, Iraq, Gaza, and the West Bank. And primarily those kind of like the latter three, like the war experiences, aren't so much about like a large scale management of disaster, but competence and feeling comfortable in environments that are really chaotic and dangerous. So I had written a emergency shelter plan because, again, winter is approaching, and there was no plan for how to house people, how to prevent transmission of really highly contagious diseases. If, for example, there's a blizzard and you have to gather 100 people into a building, what do you do if somebody has an extremely contagious disease? How do you keep that from just spreading rampantly? And the tribe, I have no idea how they got their hands on the plan, but they asked me to come in and talk about it. and whether or not it could be adapted specifically, for the tribe itself. And so I did that. I adapted, kind of, if you will, a shelter plan, a disaster plan for the tribe, and was named the shelter manager and director of the evacuation after that. And so, and I'm just kind of like, skipping across the surface of things here. There's a lot more that's involved, but those are the primary reasons, I think.
Well, so what was the most challenging thing about that role? It's a lot of coordination.
Yeah, it
Right.
is. Well, it's that, you have to set up kind of the right structure, because imagine that you have somebody come through the door and it's 20 below zero, and it's 11 p.m. and they're exhausted. Their tent blew away in 60-mile-an-hour winds, and they got maced and had hypothermia the previous day, and they're really traumatized. So the things that you need shelter and the things that come with that. So you need to ensure that you have heating and electricity, and that you have food, and that you have people to prepare it, and that they're using good kind of health standards in that. And you need social workers, and you need physicians or nurses or paramedics or EMTs, and you need financial people that can find housing for them and pay for housing for them, because you can't house them, indefinitely. And you need people to work security, partly because people are upset and there are conflicts between people, and you need really good people that know how to manage people suffering from stress and anxiety and fear and trauma, and it all has to flow reasonably smoothly, and it all has to be done safely, so that nobody is further injured. So.
Right. I'm curious, as you're going through all that, did you, what were your greatest fears or concerns, or did you have any, or were you just sort of like, okay, this is it, we're doing it, I'm doing it, I've had experience at this, I know what I'm doing? I mean, was there anything that really stood out to you as far as like, okay, I'm really concerned about this? And I'm just curious, because you hear a lot about people who do so many humanitarian efforts. I'm just curious what goes on inside of you as you're moving through all that.
Well, there's sort of like, there's personal concerns, and then there's sort of like, you call them sort of like these systemic concerns. And the personal concerns are about, what if I make a bad decision and someone dies? For example, for me, I'm not trained to do much medically beyond first aid CPR. But if I fail to create a system in which a patient with really severe hypothermia can be treated, then maybe someone dies. And, there's always this kind of anxiety about, are you doing the right things in order to create a safe environment and a responsive environment for people? And then there are these kind of more social concerns, which are, how do I manage conflicts between people, and how do I ensure that, for example, we had 3 people go out to try to reach 5 men that had been trapped in a truck, and the blizzard had run off the road in the midst of just a hellacious storm. And we have to basically rig a rescue crew to go out and find them and hopefully try to bring them back, because they may not survive the night. And question being, of course, have you given the right amount of instructions? Are they well clothed? Are they going to come back with severe frostbite?
Right.
Are their cell phones going to last for more than 3 minutes in the cold? Again, this is like, we had temperatures that dropped down to 20 below zero. The wind chill would easily be 45 below zero. So it's stuff like that. You worry that somebody's going to come in with a gun and start shooting people. You have people who come in who are intoxicated and belligerent, and how do you talk them down? From a desire to hurt people, and things like that. And it gets pretty extreme.
I can imagine. I mean, I can't imagine. I can't imagine. So, yeah, thank you for those insights. I mean, so talk to us about Frontline and how that eventually came into being. So, uh,
Mhm.
a group of you were there doing your own things and often maybe collaborating on things at Standing Rock. But that's really sort of where all of you began. And then can you describe the evolution of how Frontline came into being? I find this very
Sure.
fascinating. And then a little bit about what Frontline actually does, which I find absolutely compelling. People got a glimpse of it at the beginning before our interview, but yeah, let's talk about that.
I would say that many of us worked in Frontline. Not everyone that's currently like a medical provider with us or doing other kind of volunteer work was there, but primarily the people that are kind of the movers and shakers, if you will, the organizers within Frontline, saw how that medical system operated and realized that if you're going to do siege movements in particular, and I would describe Standing Rock as a kind of a siege movement where you have a population that's isolated, that it's enormous. Again, maybe as many as somewhere between 8,000 to 10,000 people. They're dispersed kind of in different environments. They're subject to different kinds of health problems and under different kinds of threats, and particularly if they're under attack almost continuously. What kind of a system do you need to construct that will protect them? And first and foremost, how do you deal with their mental health needs? Because it's an extremely stressful environment to be in. And a lot of the folks that come into this work came into it, I think, because they're either the victims of trauma or they just really can't tolerate seeing people abused. And so they're driven on moral grounds to do this kind of work. So it behooves us to protect them and to try to make sure that resilience is supported. So we have worked to create a medical system that we now have involvements in 3 different countries, and we want to expand within reason, and and kind of in accordance with how many members we have and how well we can serve people, to be able to support civil resistance movements, nonviolent ones, all over the world. And that system has never existed in history. There are a lot of groups that provide humanitarian aid, and a lot of groups that provide disaster aid, but there has never been a system that specifically focuses on nonviolent civil resistance.
Well, that's
So
a milestone in and of itself. What 3 countries again?
we have involvements in Kenya, in Germany, here in the U.S., and a couple of other places where activists are at risk, and we wouldn't necessarily want to say openly about those affiliations. There are some areas where we work in where there's extrajudicial killings of activists, where they're specifically disappeared because of that work. And this is something we haven't really gotten into, and it's kind of like an aside, but a very crucial one, which is that we have a lot of support from people who do cybersecurity work, and that's a really important foundation of what Frontline is about, because we have to protect those relationships with people so that they're not put at risk.
Right, right. Do you feel that the level of injustice is not quite realized in the mass populace? especially in the areas that you're working in now?
Yeah, I would say that there's not a lot of awareness in the sense of maybe an experiential awareness. A lot of people sort of like they have this peripheral knowledge, right? You can certainly see the really horrific consequences of these ICE raids, for example, or people, particularly when you see like the parent of a child with leukemia arrested and deported, and the child remains in the U.S., potentially to die alone. You sort of start to wonder, how much worse could it get, and why isn't everybody aware of this? So I wouldn't say so much that it's a lack of a knowledge that it's happening. I would say that a lot of people dissociate from it as being something that impacts them directly, or their quality of life, right, or their jobs, or their standing in the community, and things like that. So that's, I think, where the dissociation is at. But, even more importantly, I think that a lot of people are not aware about what nonviolent civil resistance is and how effective it is in the world in opposing really brutal regimes.
Right.
And that if...
Yeah, that's true. I lived, in Santa Cruz for many years in the Center for Nonviolent Communication, and it was profoundly effective there. And some of the articles we wrote about what they were doing, it still haunts me in a way. What goes into it, and what the mass populace doesn't really know about that. And as you said, because they're not directly affected, let's say, or it doesn't affect their weekly or daily life. I find that very interesting. So what do you think is one of the two most unique things that Frontline is now offering for folks in the areas that you're in?
Two unique things. One would be mental health services. So if you are a social justice activist, or if you're engaged in a nonviolent civil resistance movement, we have therapists who can do telemedicine primarily, meaning that either by phone, by video, sometimes in person, to be able to address either past traumas, more immediate traumas. For example, if you're the victim of police brutality, if you've been arrested and mistreated at a protest, we have people who are certified to treat those kinds of problems. And the second thing that we're doing is, really is related to building the ability to serve people, which is training medics. So we're certifying people in first aid and CPR, and we're very actively recruiting competent, qualified, and committed people to do this kind of work.
How do you stay calm during all that, in the midst of chaos?
Do I stay calm?
How do you do you stay calm?
Yes.
You seem like a very calm individual, a very grounded individual, which it seems to be that people I've spoken to in that field often they have to hold a space for others or a community, and that's a huge responsibility. So how do you remain calm and grounded? I mean, because that's what you're reflecting back at me, so I'm reflecting it back at you. I'm just curious.
Yeah. I would say, in a way, it's sort of like I am made that way for a very dark reason, and
for a very dark reason.
For a very dark reason.
Okay, spill it.
Training, on the job training, in a sense. So, my father was a very violent alcoholic, and a very abusive man. He died when I was 13. But what I remember best about him would be lying in bed at night waiting for him to come home and get a beating.
Mm.
So when, he would finally show up and we'd go through that, what I could do then for the next day or a couple of days would was pretty much be assured that he wasn't going to abuse me again. So it's sort of like this template, that you are made in a way to almost favor a kind of really chaotic or dangerous circumstance because you're so inured to it that it is your middle ground. It's like the flat line. It's normal. It's normal. It's normalcy. So I think sometimes, when I wonder why I got into like disaster relief work and things like that, I think he had a lot to do with it. And I imagine other folks are the same, and that's part of their motivation because they just don't want to tolerate people being treated that way. And we're not just talking about like an individual tyrant, but systems of tyranny.
Mm. Mm. I can relate a little bit to what you're saying. I mean, I have friends and colleagues that have had similar experiences, and having come from an alcoholic home too, I totally get that the baseline is chaos, a little bit of chaos, and you kind of learn how to orchestrate through that and maneuver through that, and um, it's fascinating. It does create a template for a lot of the rest of your life, and I think a lot of us, when we get to a point of realizing, okay, that's sort of what's playing itself out, how do we turn that to good? Or how do we turn that within ourselves into something more positive that we can be bringing out into the world? For me, I would say it's through my creativity and, words and multimedia things. And for you, obviously, through your humanitarian efforts, and probably others as well. I find it unique that you brought it up several times, the mental health component for folks in these areas, and because do you feel that there could be more attention on issues of mental health, especially for folks that are even in your situation, helping others, and those who are also going through chaos and uncertainty and transition that is major?
Yes, I think there could be a lot more emphasis on it, but ultimately the responsibility is on us, the people that do the work, to take steps to protect ourselves or to get treatment and things like that. There's this kind of a martyrdom complex, I think, that's at play a lot of times, in which people who are driven to do social justice work think that others are more deserving of care. And maybe they're going to be using up resources, or that if they take the time to, go hiking or go fishing or do whatever, that the work's not getting done. And I mean, this kind of eats at me too. And I'm sure other people do the same thing. And so there's this sort of, self-sacrificial dimension, and people, I think many of them ultimately burn out or they get sick. They're so traumatized, overworked, that they lose their effectiveness. And this is another reason why Frontline is created, is to circumvent that loss of personal power and capacity to do good in the world.
Right.
So
Right. Wow. Wow. Personal power. Do you ever get angry? You're in
oh
these
yeah.
you get in these situations and you're seeing a lot of like, what?
Oh yeah.
I mean, do
Yeah,
you
with this administration in particular, and I'm giving you a personal perspective, but I think that a lot of folks that work with us are dealing with the same problem, which is frustration, which is sadness, grief at seeing people harmed, at seeing the rise in white supremacy, and seeing oppression of women and racial groups, and it's maddening. I can think a reality winner comes to mind immediately.
Right.
Reality Winner in jail in Georgia right now.
Exactly. Yeah.
She, you know, special counsel Mueller is trying to find evidence of collusion, if it's there, or trying to find to what degree there might have been collusion in Russian hacking of the 2016 presidential election. Reality Winner exposed the actual problem, and she's the one who's in jail.
Right.
So when we look at things like that, when we see kind of like these inversions of values, where people who have engaged in warrantless surveillance of Americans and activists in particular are out there, free reign. They're golfing at $3 million a trip on the taxpayer's expense. And people who have actually done the work and done something beneficial to expose crimes are the ones in prison. It can be infuriating. And I partly deal with it with satire, and
With satire.
it's a little more complicated than poking fun at it, right? Because it's a much more kind of demonic dimension, that evil aspect of what we're facing. But that's part of my way of coping with it. Yeah. The onions are the onion might be the greatest mental health resource the world has. Sardonic, satirical humor.
Satirical humor, right. What do you feel we as a country, those of us that live in suburbia, let's say, or even in the cities, what can we do? What are things that we can do today, this week, this month, this year?
Well, about 6 months ago, I discovered the International Center for Nonviolent Conflict in the Albert Einstein Institution. And they are the world's preeminent trainers of nonviolent civil resistance activists. And I think the very biggest impact that you can have is to study what makes nonviolent civil resistance effective. What are the strategy? What are the tactics? Why is it so much more successful than violent resistance? And once you kind of begin to accrete all of those kind of concepts, you can make them tangible in your life. And the Albert Einstein Institution and International Center for Nonviolent Conflict are absolutely the best resources for that. And also the leaders of the Otpor movement in Serbia, the youth organization, very kind of, ad hoc organization that overthrew Slobodan Milosevic in 2000. They have trainings, and they have this amazing manual. It's called the Canvas Manual. And those should be really the Bible for people doing this kind of work, because it is not enough to get a Sharpie and some cardboard and march around the block a few times. The government is not going to fall to its knees weeping because you are against the oppression of gays,
right,
or because you think Americans should have health care. If the government was amenable to those kinds of ethical arguments, the problems wouldn't have existed to begin with. So the way to address that dissociation between conscience and policy and behavior is to learn how to resist. And it isn't exclusively in marching. Gene Sharp is a really amazing writer and theorist about how nonviolent movements are constructed. So I highly recommend people get interested immediately. Again, this is part of why we have this really strong affiliation between Frontline and Gene Sharp's work, is because if we can encourage people to learn how to more effectively resist, and we can address their health problems, these movements where dictators are deposed and people are no longer preyed upon, or we can diminish that predatory behavior to any degree, we're dramatically shortening the amount of time that they're going to be exposed to that kind of harm. More people will live, less people will suffer, the quality of life will rise. So it's crucial, absolutely crucial, to learn how to be effective.
Exactly.
Cardboard and Sharpie are not it.
Cardboard and Sharpies are not it. Basically, if many of us gave up a movie or two each month and studied some of the things that you talked about and got more involved, that would be a good beginning, right?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily say that any of that kind of fun stuff should necessarily be given up, but it's sort of like, let's say that you have a drive really to learn something new, something sort of shocking, and I find it really shocking. For example, that over the course of 1900 to 2006, there have been some 323 at least civil resistance movements, and of those, I think it's around 58% that were nonviolent were successful in overthrowing dictators, in ousting foreign invaders, or creating secession of one region from a country. But only 26% of violent movements have been successful. So, sort of like the common thinking is you want to change something and you want to do it really fast and you want it to be effective, get a gun. No, it's exactly the opposite. Not only is violence a less effective way to create a new system of government or a more responsive system of government, ethical system of government, but those governments don't tend to last very long before they backslide into dictatorship and fascism. So it's really surprising to find that there are techniques and tactics where people can systematically learn how to oust some of the most brutal tyrants in history, and they can do it somewhat empty-handed, but it's still a means of warfare. Gene Sharp called it a means with other tools. Not guns, not tanks, not bombs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
Eric Chenoweth, I would really highly recommend if somebody, your inclination is to watch movies, watch Erica Chenoweth's TED Talks talking about nonviolence, or Jamila Rakib from the Albert Einstein Institution. They are hugely inspiring, and you just come away from that absolutely blown away. You had no idea how effective this system of resistance could be. But it takes getting interested in learning the tools.
Right. It's interesting. Your insights are very thought-provoking, and I think people are going to really appreciate hearing this. So let me finish off with just a few more questions for you. I'm curious what you've learned about humanity in all of your travels. You've been to Honduras for the hurricane in 1998, the Gaza and West Bank in 2003, Rwanda at the end of the Civil War in 1996. You've seen a lot. You've experienced a lot. You've been through a lot. I'm curious what you have learned, maybe both good and more curious, about humanity during all this, or one of the most interesting things.
The thing that immediately comes to mind is how strongly opposed kind of the demonization of people is to their actual value as human beings. And I'm thinking specifically about Muslims. I'm thinking about Middle Easterners, because when I went to Iraq in 2003, I thought I was going to be on the run all the time, trying to avoid, getting shot or blown up. And what I found in these people that had just been really demonized by the U.S. government, by kind of culture at large, was that they were the kindest people, the most hospitable people that I had ever met in my life. Now, you can kind of like say this in a really generic way, and it might not mean much, but consider the context. So I had been there before the war started. I got kicked out of the country. I was accused of being a spy. It was on the front page of the national newspaper. And then I went back in after the war started. Now, imagine, you are in a country that has just gone through the sanctions program. There are, on average, 4,000 Iraqis age 5 and under every month that die due to malnutrition, starvation, deprivation through that sanctions program. And your country has invaded, has bombed, is killing people. And now, how do you expect to be treated? Not like your royalty, which is really, in many ways, I would say how I was treated. You do not expect that level of civility or generosity from people that have been victimized by your country, who had absolutely nothing to do with the 9/11 attacks, but were blamed for it, were used kind of like a shooting gallery to illustrate, I think, to the world, this is what we can do to you, even if we just accuse you of terrorism. This is how deeply you will suffer. And it was their kindness that really made me completely reorient myself toward disbelief anytime people are demonized. Anytime you have this kind of blanket indictment against a religion or an ethnic group or people of almost any orientation whatsoever, it's to find out for myself what it's like to be in their presence, if at all I can. And it's that system by which people are demonized that just drives me crazy, and it never stops hurting with Iraq in particular. And with what I see are the abuses and persecution of Muslims in this country. Hmm. Can I give you just sort of like a little aside about what it's like really there? So when I went to Gaza, I got off a bus, could not tell you what street I was on. Of course, I'm just completely lost. I've got these giant bags, camera equipment, and whatnot. I do not walk to the end of the block before 3 Palestinians in a little Toyota pickup truck pull over, ask me, where are you going? Do you need help? What have you? I load my stuff up in their truck. They take me to lunch. They drive me to my hotel. I never see them again. People take care of you. I mean, imagine you get off a bus in Philadelphia with a suitcase. How far are you going to walk before somebody pulls over and offers you a lift or wants to buy you lunch because you have blue eyes, and because they're honored to meet you, despite the fact that people very much like you have caused a lot of suffering in their part of the world. It's 180 degrees from what the government presents to you as the quality of those human beings.
That's fascinating. Somebody else I spoke with really revealed that interesting element as well. I'm curious, Joel, what gives you the most, or what brings you the most hope?
Learning about nonviolent civil resistance, because I know it is an amazing system. It's sort of obscure to people, and it almost sounds sort of academic. It's like a theory. No, it is a means. It is techniques. It is tactics. And I think that the greatest hope for humanity, if we're thinking about like orienting ourselves toward one most effective, most dramatic way of changing the world, it's in nonviolent civil resistance. And there are great organizations that teach it. You just have to kind of knuckle down and believe that it's going to take more commitment, more involvement, more intellectual engagement, more strategy than cardboard and Sharpie are currently giving us. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I don't want to completely discount the symbolic value of marching around with a sign. It helps to show numbers, and it helps to show resistance. It's just not a strong lever when it comes to actually changing the structure of leadership.
Right.
You know, getting a dictator out of the palace.
Right. Right. If there's one thing that's going on in the world right now, that you could point people to, that they might need to be more aware of, as far as an injustice or something remarkable that's occurring that they might not know about, what would that be?
Well, that's quite a grab bag. But
Isn't it, though?
I would have to choose from. Is like there is no dearth of, you know, really horrific things to snatch at in this case. And abuse, kind of tough to fall down on one or the other.
Let's say in America.
One, I'm thinking in terms of kind of pragmatism. Like, if you knew about this, would you be better off? And I would say that repression of activism itself, the criminalization of dissent, is what is the overarching thing I would encourage people to get concerned about and to address. And one of the most immediate ways you can do that is to learn some cybersecurity. Learn how to protect yourself, the people that you affiliate with, and make sure that the work that you're doing isn't going to get undermined. Because, you know, if you think about tactics in the military, you don't necessarily go after individuals if you really want to be effective. You want to go after movements. You want to undermine their ability to communicate with each other. You want to expose who are your greatest opponents and what their thinking is. And so there we're talking about warrantless surveillance, and we're talking about things like in North Dakota, you know, back in, I think it was mid 2017, last year, where the state legislature tried to pass laws in which it was legal to run over protesters. Right. If someone was in the streets with a sign and you ran them down, you were not liable. They were at fault because they were protesting. And it's like the arresting of medics who were providing care to demonstrators, and the Trump inaugural party address, what have you. It's those kind of systems of oppression that are trying to inculcate fear in people on the grounds that if you are in opposition to this government, you are a target. You are a marked human being. So looking at how those things work and what you can do to specifically oppose the criminalization of dissent and protect yourself are probably the most effective immediate things people can do. And we are dealing with that with Frontline as well. Our newest member of the board of directors is Leisha Sterling, who is the executive director of Geeks Without Bounds. Really one of the preeminent cybersecurity people in the world. And one of her roles is to help us protect activists from warrantless surveillance and from being hacked and, being corralled and harmed by governments. And it's not a concern only in the U.S. It's a concern all over the world.
Mm, amazing. Amazing. Joel, I want to thank you so much for your candid insights and sharing and connecting. It was a pleasure to connect with you today. Folks, take a look at your screen and find out a little bit more about where you can learn about Joel Preston Smith and Frontline and become involved and learn more about the things that you can do to make a difference. So, Joel, thank you so much for being on today's episode. You are a true agent of change, and it's wonderful to connect. So, thank you. Thanks for all you do.
Thanks very much. I appreciate it, Greg.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, folks, until next time, have a great day.